They did not truly let it sink in until the moment they pushed her onto the landing craft. Only then did Sato Harumi realize she was not being sent to die. She was being kept alive. For a Japanese soldier raised from childhood on the certainty that capture equals death, this was more terrifying than death itself. Death could redeem her. Living could not be explained. On that stretch of coral beach, burned black by bombardment, she struggled with everything she had left, even trying to slam her head against the metal rail of the craft, determined to disappear in a loyal manner before she ever reached American soil. But the American soldiers held her down. Those large hands pinned her like a frightened bird. No beating, no insults, not even the indignity of having her cap torn away. And that frightened her more. The silence of the enemy gave her less room to escape than a gun barrel ever could. Why won't they let me die? This was the first and the most agonizing fear that seized her after the collapse of the South Pacific front. The stench of seawater, smoke, blood and mud clung to her face, but her shoulder insignia remained neat. Her rank was still there. Her honor was still there. But the world was no longer operating according to any rules she understood. At the very end of a war, a person is not felled by weakness, but by the moment their old world collapses without warning. On the landing craft, shaken hard by the waves, Sato Harumi dug her nails into her palms until bright blood welled up between her fingers. The pain kept her conscious. It also fixed a single fact in her mind. She was being transported to a world that was not hers, the mainland United States. Waves slapped against the hull. Machinery roared. Every vibration felt like a taunting reminder. This was a scene of shame, never described in the Empire's textbooks. She was supposed to die in some valley in the South Pacific, covered with palm fronds, reported as fallen in heroic battle. Instead, she was alive. And she was a prisoner. To her, this was something that should not be allowed to exist. Harumi made a second attempt to hurl herself over the side, to climb the rails and throw herself into the sea. To be swallowed by the waves was, in her mind, far more dignified than being taken for questioning and labeled a POW. She even sank her teeth into her own arm, using pain to steel her resolve. But the American soldiers moved quickly, forcing her down onto the wooden boards again. A grey-eyed medic crouched beside her and said, in a brief, almost indifferent tone, "Calm down." She did not understand English, but she understood the tone perfectly, neither hostile nor sympathetic. It was the tone of someone going through a procedure, treating her like an item of military property that had to be preserved. The enemy treating her as something to be protected suffocated her more than any weapon. The air inside the ship was stifling. Her cap sat crooked on her hair. Salt stains on her uniform had been re-wet by sweat and stuck to her skin. She felt humiliated, but she was also painfully aware of one undeniable fact. The Americans had not hit her, had not humiliated her, had even offered her a canteen. She refused to drink and shoved it away hard, as if refusing that water were a way to hold on to the last shred of loyalty. Droplets splashed on the floor. She pressed her lips together so tightly it hurt, as if to say, refusing this sip meant refusing to betray her country. Sometimes fanatic loyalty lies even closer to instinct than fear itself. As the transport ship slowly pulled away from the island, she saw blasted trees toppled like blackened bones and knew that former comrades in arms, fellow soldiers and wounded men had all been left upon that scorched earth. A sharp pain clenched in Harumi's chest, not for the dead but for herself. She had not died. She was unworthy. So, in the hold of the ship, she took a second drastic step. She tried to tear off the bandage the Americans had applied to her wound. The bandage was not even hers. The grey-eyed medic had wrapped it around her after she struck her head during the struggle. His hands had been light, but to her it felt like an insult. She raised her fingers and yanked at the cotton. Thin fabric tore with a faint ripping sound. She wanted the Americans to see that she refused to be mended, refused to be preserved by them. But no one stopped her. No one shouted. No one drew a gun. No one slapped her. The grey-eyed medic only looked at her tearing the bandage away and said, almost in passing, "We have more." Then he turned away to rearrange his medical kit, as if he were arranging paperwork, not dealing with an enemy soldier. Harumi's hand froze in mid-air. She suddenly did not know how to go on proving her loyalty. In the Japanese military narrative, the enemy enrages, punishes, forces, but this enemy did nothing. Her resistance fell into deep water without so much as an echo. When you throw yourself at the wall of hatred with all your strength and find only empty space, all that remains is confusion. The transport ship sailed for 7 days and 7 nights. Harumi lost all sense of day and night. She measured time by seasickness and the burning in her stomach. Every day the Americans delivered fortified biscuits, sharp-edged, hard-shelled American rations. She had never seen anything like them. She refused to eat, endured hunger with clenched teeth, as if that alone could prove she was still following the code of loyalty. On the 4th day, she nearly collapsed. It was not weakness. It was her body beginning to protest. The medic brought her warm water and another biscuit. This time he did not leave it on a tray. He broke off a piece himself and set it gently on the bench beside her, then walked away. No coercion, no watching to see if she ate. Harumi stared at that piece of biscuit for 2 full hours. In the end, shaking, she ate it. She hated herself for it, but she needed to stay alive, not to betray her country, but to understand what kind of humiliation the enemy was inflicting on her. At dawn, the ship docked. The air was damp and cold, carrying that distinct mix of salt and metal she would later recognize as the smell of American shores. Harumi was pushed down the gangway. When her boots hit the icy concrete, she felt as if the world were rearranging her place in it. But she did not know what that place was. She saw harbor lights still glowing faintly. Lining the pier were female American personnel in uniform, checking the numbers of each woman prisoner with a calm efficiency. Harumi underwent a rough search. She braced herself for humiliation. But the movements were by the book. Gloved hands remained clean. No mockery, no shouting, no deliberate cruelty, only procedure. For the first time, something foreign struck Harumi's heart. Confusion. The cold neutrality of a system was harder to resist than any knife. In the chill wind, Harumi was placed in formation. Her back was held ramrod straight, like a lone bamboo stem trying to maintain dignity in a winter gale. She expected taunts when they entered the camp. Exhibition, humiliation, being paraded like a trophy. Instead, her world turned upside down. Female personnel checked names off a list, one by one, in flat voices without color. A ration standard chart had been posted by the camp entrance, high on a notice board. In black print on white paper, it spelled out caloric values, nutritional breakdowns, vitamin allotments, and medical round schedules. The enemy's regulations were more open, more transparent, more accountable than anything she had ever seen in the Japanese army. When her cap was collected for storage, she automatically assumed it was a deliberate humiliation. But the American woman in charge of the ledger merely said, "We'll keep it safe so it doesn't get lost." Harumi froze for a moment. She watched them carefully bag and number each prisoner's personal effects. No one tried to seize her belongings. No one used them to control or threaten her. Her loyalty suddenly had nowhere to go. Behind the iron gate lay a living area, neatly arranged and utterly alien. Tents were clean from flooring to guy lines in a way that did not match the last months of war. The air in the walkway smelled of disinfectant. Bales of bandages were stacked in perfect blocks, white as snow, a direct contrast to the yellowed fabric of her own uniform. She had to look away. That cleanliness felt like mockery of everything she had once believed. The more her heart hurt, the fiercer her loyalty burned. At roll call that evening, she did the third extreme thing that would be entered in her record. She shouted as loudly as she could, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor. Her voice was hoarse, full of 8 parts frenzy and 2 parts despair. She expected American soldiers to rush forward, curse, seize her by the collar, drag her off as an example. Everyone froze for 2 seconds. Then roll call resumed. The American woman with the roster in hand simply touched her pencil lightly to the paper and said to the colleague beside her, "Mark her as stressed. Not dangerous, not fanatical, not enemy. Stressed." A psychological note. Harumi's voice was swallowed by the thick air, as if it had fallen into a bottomless well. When fervor fails to provoke a reaction, loyalty begins to echo back on itself. She did not sleep at all that night. She could not accept being labeled stress response. In her world, loyalty was supposed to inspire fear, respect, resistance, not be recorded as a mental state on a piece of paper. The next day, she went even further. She attempted self-harm, scratching her arm with the metal cutlery issued by the camp, a last demonstration of loyalty. It was something she had learned from imperial education. If you cannot die for your country, you must at least show the enemy that you still belong to Japan. As she raised the metal edge to her skin, a Japanese-American interpreter rushed in and snatched the utensil from her hand. The movement was clean and practiced, almost identical to the way military medics intervened in field hospitals. In a low, stern voice, he said in Japanese, "Don't make us lose another one of our own here." The word struck her like lightning. That was not the enemy's voice. It was the voice of someone from her own people, coming from inside an enemy uniform. Her mind went completely blank for an instant. American medics arrived on the alert and escorted her to the medical tent. She braced herself for interrogation, for punishment. But what awaited her under the canvas was a scene completely unlike anything at the front. Stretchers were aligned in order. The smell of disinfectant was sharp and clean. American nurses were writing down temperatures. Another nurse was counting rolls of gauze. The treatment schedule was posted on the wall, clearly listing rounds and basic health records for each prisoner. Harumi was seated on a folding chair in the corner. A nurse gently lifted her arm to inspect the faint, uncompleted scratch on her skin. The nurse did not scold her, did not show disgust, only asked, "Does it hurt?" Harumi did not understand English, but the tone conveyed another question. "Why are you doing this?" A sharp humiliation cut through her, not from the enemy, but from herself. For the first time, she realized that no one was trying to turn her into a more compliant kind of prisoner. The enemy was not forcing her toward anything. All her dramatic gestures were like punches thrown at the air. When the medic placed a cup of water and a packet of fortified biscuits in front of her yet again, she refused a second time. But unlike on the transport, this time they did not try harder to make her accept it. They set the biscuits by her feet and went back to work. Then she suddenly understood something worse than captivity. The enemy did not care about her loyalty. They did not harm her, did not provoke her, did not exploit her fanaticism, did not attempt to break her beliefs. They were simply maintaining her existence as a living organism. Here, for the first time, a fracture appeared in the structure of her loyalty. That night she lay in her tent and heard someone crying softly nearby, another Japanese woman prisoner. The sound was not shrill, not dramatic, just the quiet weeping of a human being dragged to the farthest edge of war. Harumi buried her head in her blanket. For the first time she wondered, if the enemy was not as vicious as she had believed, what was it exactly that she was serving? In the 3rd week after entering the camp, Sato Harumi was informed that she had been assigned to assist with basic duties behind the hospital lines. This order was neither a punishment nor a reward. Her number had simply come up on the list. The interpreter conveyed the information in a neutral tone, as if delivering standard administrative news. Harumi's refusal was instinctive. She stressed that she was a Japanese soldier and would not perform any work for the enemy. Her refusal was duly recorded. The assignment went ahead regardless. No one altered the procedure because of what she had said. When she first stepped into the logistics area, it was the environment that made her stop in her tracks. The medical tents were laid out with a clarity she had never seen. Supplies were clearly categorized. Rolls of gauze were stacked in layers by size. Metal instruments soaked in disinfectant of uniform concentration. On the registry table lay a series of patient records of identical thickness. In field hospitals, Harumi had known only chaos, scarcity, and improvised treatment, never anything approaching the standards of a home-front hospital. Her first task was to carry bandages. A nurse indicated, with a simple gesture, that she should pass them to the nearest medic. As Harumi handed over the first roll, she focused on the man on the table, a wounded American soldier, his leg torn by an explosion, undergoing debridement. Minutes later, another nurse signaled for more, this time to another bed, a Japanese prisoner with a severely infected wound from the island's brutal conditions. The medic took bandages from the same pile for both men, with no difference in movement. Harumi saw, for the first time, the Americans handling the cases of two nationalities at the same desk. The nurse asked about temperatures using the same routine. The medic followed identical steps for cleaning and dressing wounds. Harumi tried to detect some difference in expression, tone, or gesture between how they treated the two. She could not. For a brief instant she hesitated. What she saw did not match her expectations. For the rest of the afternoon, all she did was carry instruments, resupply gauze, collect soiled cloth. The work was monotonous, but the routines were complete. No ad hoc orders, no emotional shouting. Everything followed a sequence. Debride, bandage, record, review. Even when someone groaned in pain, the flow did not break. Harumi had always taken it for granted that, of course, the enemy will mistreat Japanese people. But what she saw in that tent refused to fit that narrative. The Americans' medical care did not downgrade the Japanese prisoner by 1 degree. Her observations began to diverge from her beliefs. Her previous framework and the facts before her no longer aligned. When she left the tent, camp lights were already coming on. Sea wind carried a trace of salt through the wire. She did not try to label what she had seen, nor to explain it. She only allowed herself, in a brief moment, to recognize one thing. For the first time, her understanding of war had encountered something she could not quickly categorize. It was the earliest sign of reflection. Not a change of allegiance, but a gap opening in her structure of understanding. Over the following weeks, her duties in the hospital remained fixed. There was no discussion, no bargaining. Each morning the roster went up on the notice board. Her number appeared in its usual slot. She had been absorbed into a system that did not depend on anyone's will and did not shift with anyone's moods. For someone raised in a Japanese military culture of personal rule through hierarchy, such standardization was surprisingly hard to adapt to. Her scope of work gradually expanded. From carrying bandages, she moved on to helping log temperatures, sorting clean and contaminated instruments on the medic's instruction, delivering fortified biscuits to different beds. No one asked her to feel sympathy for the wounded. No one asked her to change camps. Every instruction was terse, procedural, emotionless. Each task belonged to the realm of daily administration. During this period, she began to notice details. Before cleaning a Japanese prisoner's wound, the American nurse would still say a soft, "All right," even if he did not understand English. When checking sutures after an amputation, the medic would not skip steps because the patient was an enemy. Even the simple act of handing over a cup of water followed written guidelines. No impatience, no extra fuss, no change in treatment. Harumi tried to find exceptions, signs that enemy and ally are treated differently, just hidden better. But the more closely she watched, the more she saw that the routines did not bend for anyone. They were written rules, not attitudes. Her confusion deepened. She had once believed war was a moral confrontation between nations. In the hospital, it was nothing but medical terminology, infection levels, risks of sepsis, standard dosages. For the first time, she encountered a reality in which war does not need hatred to cause immense harm. One afternoon, a seriously wounded Japanese prisoner was brought in. His injuries were complex and required immediate debridement. Harumi was told to assist with instruments. She walked more slowly than usual, expecting to see what she already knew: rough treatment, scarce materials, hasty decisions. The scene ahead was nothing like that. All instruments had been precisely sterilized and laid out on identical stainless steel trays. The nurse read the steps aloud. The medic followed without skipping any part. Even unconscious, the Japanese prisoner received full treatment according to protocol. Harumi's eyes paused on the chart. Its format differed from what she had seen in the Imperial Army. The columns were more detailed. Signature lines were complete. Space for notes was ample. Even pain levels had standardized ranges. It dawned on her that here, the wounded were not a nation's expendable assets. They were cases to be restored. The difference unsettled her. It was not shame inflicted from outside. It was the discomfort of facing something entirely unfamiliar. After the debridement, Harumi was told to dispose of used gauze and necrotic tissue. She stood by the metal bin for a few seconds, staring at the blood-soaked cloth. For once, she did not immediately think of the enemy. She thought of a colder question. How is this wound different from ours? It was not. The same type of blasts, the same risk of infection, the same progression of pain. Without uniforms, there was no way to tell nations apart. It was the first time she formed a judgment based on fact instead of allegiance. That evening, washing her hands at the tap, she listened to the steady fall of water and smelled the lingering disinfectant on her skin. A realization came quietly. In the South Pacific, she had never seen this many intact bandages, this consistent a process. Not because there were fewer wounded, but because resources had not been organized. This did not overturn her loyalty at once, but it did make her aware that being a defeated nation and being badly managed were not the same thing. She said nothing about it. Silent, she carried this knowledge alone. It was the rarest silence of her military life. By the 4th week after their arrival at Pearl Harbor, Sato Harumi's number appeared on the cleaning assistant's schedule. There was no "do you agree" attached, just a chart, a line, and a routine. She reported to the debridement area on time. It was among the most demanding units: fresh wounds, repeat debridement, infection control, post-amputation checks. She had seen wounded men before, but always in the chaos and shortages of field hospitals, never in a place like this. Metal trays glowed cold white under the lamps, instruments soaked in measured disinfectant. On clipboards, someone had written wound grades, infection indices, observation periods. Each station had its own supply of gauze, bandages, anesthetics, and disposal containers. The scene was the exact opposite of the front. Quiet, systematized, controlled. No shouting, no unplanned rushing. Everyone moved according to protocol. She'd expected to be placed at the periphery because prisoners of war were rarely trusted with key supplies. Instead, a nurse pressed a roll of fresh gauze into her hand and indicated that she should allocate it according to the chart. There were no special warnings, no extra monitoring, no differential treatment. She was absorbed as if she were an ordinary assistant. From her place in the central aisle, she saw for the first time enemy and Allied wounded being treated in the same room. On the left lay a Japanese soldier captured in the Philippines, leg infected after trauma, skin dark red and swollen. On the right lay a U.S. sailor wounded in the Okinawa landings, abdominal stitches already removed but still needing dressings changed. The two men came from opposing sides of the war, but they lay in the same space, handled by the same group of medical staff, with the same tools and the same sequence of actions. At a nurse's signal, Harumi handed over the first roll of bandages. The medic used it for the Japanese prisoner's leg, hands steady, tone neutral. Harumi waited for the moment where something would shift, some sign that enemy and comrade were not really equal. It never came. When it was time for the next station, the nurse gestured again. Harumi turned, passed another roll of bandages, and watched the medic treat the American soldier with the exact same steps. Check the wound, wipe away seepage, apply sterile gauze, fix it, record. The rhythm of metal tools tapping, the timing of commands, held steady on both sides. She realized she was witnessing something that contradicted everything she had ever been taught. In the Japanese system, enemy wounds were skipped or handled with minimal resources at the very lowest priority. Here, resources were ample, procedures coherent. Status did not matter. The wound itself dictated the work. She began to pay closer attention. The American sailor's temperature, 98.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The Japanese prisoners, 102.1 degrees Fahrenheit. The nurse's expression did not change as she compared them. The medic told the Japanese man, "You need rest." His voice was level, without irony or condescension. Dosages followed weight and condition, not nationality. Harumi had been certain she would find the Americans favoring their own, even in subtle ways. But the more she looked, the more she understood that such differences were not being hidden. They did not exist, because the system did not allow them. Nurses and medics repeated the same protocols, as if obeying a rule higher than national borders. Harumi paused between the two beds. No one noticed that moment, but for her it was decisive. For the first time, she could not fit the facts into her old explanations. Her education had told her, the enemy will shame Japanese people. They will use prisoners as tools. They will prioritize saving their own. But reality laid out a different structure. The enemy's system did not permit humiliation. Their medical procedures did not drop a level for prisoners. Their protocols mattered more than enmity. This was not an argument over positions. It was a contradiction at the level of facts. The system itself had reversed her assumptions. Her hand slowed slightly as she took the third roll of bandages. That half-second pause was not fear or reluctance. It was the moment her internal framework began to rearrange itself. She understood dimly that the border she had seen as absolute between us and them no longer held in this room. Not because she had been persuaded, but because reality had refused to fit. That day, as she left the debridement chamber, she heard the iron door close behind her. The air smelled of disinfectant and salt. Light in the corridors was even, not too bright, not too dim, as if set deliberately to avoid provoking emotion. At the end of the hall, she stopped for an instant. For the first time, she recognized an important fact. Here, what she saw was not wartime propaganda. It was the cost of war. In the weeks after this reversed her expectations, Sato Harumi's view of the hospital shifted from forced compliance to active observation. She still followed her assignments, but now, when handing out tools, she tracked numbering systems. When sorting records, she noted patterns in dosages. When nurses explained steps, she memorized the order. No one had asked her to learn. No form had a studying column. Yet among the repetitive routines, she discovered that this medical system did not run on feelings. It ran on data, standards, and records. In her past, Japanese field hospitals had relied heavily on personal judgment. When resources ran short, decisions depended on experience or luck. At Pearl Harbor, there seemed to be no room for acting by feel, from the order of treatments and wound classifications to the amount of nutritional support. Every action was driven by structure. When she realized that standardization mattered more than attitude, she encountered for the first time a kind of order she could not explain using her old loyalty. What people did here was not a statement of allegiance. It was an effort to maintain life. One afternoon, a case opened a fissure in her mind that would never fully close. A young American sailor, wounded in naval combat, was wheeled in. Multiple pieces of shrapnel were lodged in his chest. He needed urgent debridement. Harumi was preparing instruments when another bed arrived. A Japanese prisoner, also in critical condition, chest compressed, breathing shallow. Both beds reached the treatment zone almost simultaneously. The nurses assigned staff according to protocol. 2 medics, 1 anesthetist, 1 recorder at each table. From her position between them, Harumi saw two timelines unfold in parallel. The sequence of actions, the order of interventions, perfectly aligned. Whichever man's condition was more critical at a given moment received priority for airway support, bleeding control, oxygen. No change in order, no delay because of nationality. She had assumed at least a small deviation would appear. The American first, the Japanese second. Nothing of the sort happened. The treatment room aligned itself solely according to vital signs. As she passed instruments back and forth, a physical hesitation came over her. She realized she was witnessing something her education had never allowed for. The enemy saving Japanese lives with no less effort than they gave their own. She was not being converted. She was being forced to watch a reality that contradicted every narrative she had heard. At the moment the Japanese prisoner briefly regained consciousness, he saw Harumi and heard in her accent the trace of the homeland. With labored breath he whispered only two words. "Stay alive." There was no politics in it, no ideology. Just a wounded man's instinct at the brink of death. Harumi could not fit this plea into the imperial language system. There was no die for the emperor, no fall honorably, just the bare request to survive. Almost at the same time, the American sailor, moments before anesthesia, looked up at the nurse and asked quietly, "Am I going to make it?" Two sentences, in the same room, overlapping in time. Stay alive. Am I going to make it? For the first time, Harumi encountered fear and the will to live in perfectly symmetrical form. No slogans, no cultural gap. At the level of the body, they were almost identical. Her mental framework finally gave way. On the surface of the wound, there was no enemy. Not long afterward, a ceasefire telegram reached Pearl Harbor. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere did not obviously change. The routines went on unchanged. But the POW camp soon received word of repatriation. Harumi's number appeared on the list of those eligible for return. Many Japanese women reacted strongly. Some wept, some fell silent, some began to prepare their belongings. Harumi, for the first time, did not respond immediately. The interpreter explained that repatriation was voluntary. They could return to Japan or remain for examination with an eye to long-term labor assignments. Those who stayed would not receive special status. They would be auxiliary workers in local hospitals, poorly paid but safe and stable. For several days she went on as usual, signing forms, logging temperatures, delivering nutrition packs. During that time she noticed something else. The hospital staff already saw her as a replaceable labor resource, not a prisoner. It was not favoritism. It was a neutral, functional judgment. Within this system she had, for the first time, a defined role not based on her identity, but on her function. That created a space in which she could choose. One evening, after finishing her final shift of the day, she stepped outside. The sky over Pearl Harbor was gold. The water reflected the light in a steady, rippling pattern. No sirens, no fires, no smoke of bombardment. It had been a long time since she had breathed air without listening for danger. Back in the camp, administrators handed out formal documents. All prisoners had 3 days to confirm whether they would return to Japan. Many signed immediately. Japanese representatives were already preparing to take over repatriation lists. Harumi stared at the blank line at the top of the form for a long time. She had never imagined that the question, "Will you go home?" could generate hesitation. Now she could not answer at once. She had always taken the homeland as the center of her life. Now, for the first time, she realized that post-war Japan might have no place for her. Pearl Harbor Hospital, however, had given her a clearly defined role. Here, she knew what she could do, what she had to do, what she would complete. All of it could be written down. When the 3-day deadline came, she turned in the form marked "Will not return." The interpreter looked up to confirm. "Are you sure?" She nodded. No explanation, no declarations, She knew perfectly well this was not betrayal. It was the first decision she had made based on reality rather than doctrine. She chose to stay not for America, but because this order allowed her, for the first time, to feel that she belonged not to war, but to healing. For the first time in her military life, she was not moved by orders. She chose the direction herself. The hospital filed the application. She transferred into the civilian labor system as a long-term auxiliary nursing worker, leaving behind the status of prisoner of war. When she changed into the new light-colored uniform issued by the hospital, the faint sense of unreality came from a simple fact. For the first time in her life, she no longer served under any flag. She also understood at last that loyalty need not vanish. It could be redefined. Post-war immigration procedures were quiet. No ceremony, no photographs, just a handful of forms, routine interviews, and a formal letter of recommendation from the hospital. The description of her in those documents was simple. Reliable in assistance, adapts to standard procedures, no disciplinary issues. Those standardized phrases earned her legal residency and allowed her to remain at Pearl Harbor Hospital as a civilian. She joined a low-ranking nursing team responsible for the most basic tasks: changing bandages, cleaning instruments, logging vital signs, moving equipment. The work was long and repetitive, devoid of glory or drama. But for Harumi, these actions meant far more than anything she had done in war, because they sustained living breaths and steady wound healing. As years passed, she became one of the stable presences at the hospital. She had no American accent and spoke little, so many mistook her for a new hire. Her signature, however, multiplied in the logbooks. 1 year, 3, 5, until her name became the most familiar one in certain wards. She never tried to forge close bonds, nor did she ever tell colleagues about her past. The system did not demand such histories. Each person only needed to function correctly in their role. So she remained quiet and enduring. In certain years, the hospital received patients from many countries: Japanese immigrants, Pacific fishermen, American workers injured in accidents. Moving among these beds, she made no distinction between her own people and others. That line had been erased for her long ago in the debridement room at Pearl Harbor. She watched temperatures, infection markers, breathing rates, not languages or histories. She never presented herself as anti-war, yet her work embodied such a stance. In medical procedure, all bodies were equal. The damage war inflicted on them did not differ by side, nor did the method of repair. Years later, letters would occasionally arrive from Japan, written by women who had shared tents with her in the POW camp. They wrote of difficulty after the war. They asked whether she regretted staying in America. She seldom answered, and never in long paragraphs. When she did reply, she wrote only one sentence: "I can be of use here." It was not an emotional statement, but a precise description of her role. After the war, being useful sustained her more than honor ever could. In later decades, colleagues at the hospital thought of her as a quiet tradition. She did not argue, did not express opinions, but any basic task left undone at the scene would be quietly completed once she arrived. A young nurse once scribbled a note in the margin of a record: "Her movements have no nationality." The line was never posted publicly, but it circulated within the hospital for a time. Harumi never heard of it. She never tried to. To her, nursing was action without voice, requiring neither story nor label. Near the end of her life, she seldom mentioned the war. The only written trace she left about it was a single sentence in a personal notebook, without date or signature: "There are many ways to tear a body apart, but only one way to mend it." The words were cool, without anger or grief, like a factual conclusion drawn from long observation. Her funeral was small, arranged by a few colleagues. No flags, no military honors, no symbols of any nation. Only a copy of her work record was placed among her effects. In that record, her name appeared again and again across the decades, the handwriting consistent, steady, clear. It was as if she had spent her life confirming one proposition. Repairing life requires no weapons and no enemies, only procedures, patience, and respect for the body itself. The mark she left at Pearl Harbor was not her nationality, not her history, but a quiet, enduring fact. She used the rest of her life to prove a simple anti-war truth. War needs no reason to cause wounds, but to mend them can take an entire lifetime.